Rape culture. Fancy girl is a term that was used by slave traders to describe young, attractive, light-skinned, female slaves who they sold to slave owners for the purpose of sexual exploitation in the pre-Civil War South. Many of these slave owners were older and married, but wanted the status of owning a young, light-skinned concubine. In New Orleans, slave traders auctioned female slaves who were children and teenagers as fancy girls. Slave owners paid a premium for teenage girls who were in their prime childbearing years, usually around 15 or 16, but as young as 13. Slave owners considered any children these girls may produce as a return on their investment. A slave owner would be under no obligation to support these slave children and could decide to keep the children or sell them. Prior to being sold to slave owners, these female slaves were generally sexually and physically abused by the slave trader. Using a modern term, the fancy trade was sex trafficking in the pre-Civil War South. However, female slaves had no legal protection. Southern slave laws dictated that slaves were the property of their owners, and owners could do as they pleased with their slaves. For instance, in 1705, the Virginia slave codes allowed slave owners to do as they pleased with their slaves, even if it resulted in the death of a slave, without any repercussions. As far as female slaves were concerned, the South was a rape culture where sexual violence against them was normalized and trivialized. Slaves could not escape abusive owners by running away. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required that slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. The act made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying escaped slaves. Fancy girls were generally the product of a sexual relationship, forced or otherwise, between a black, female slave and her white owner, the white friends and family of the owner, or the white overseer. In 1662, Virginia enacted the enactment of hereditary slavery law, which made any child who was born of a slave mother a slave for life. This law also applied to children who appeared to be white. On slave breeding farms in the Chesapeake Bay region, slave children were generally taken away from their slave mothers as soon as they were weaned and sold to cotton plantations in the Deep South. The domestic slave trade transported millions of slaves from states like Virginia and Maryland to the cotton plantations of the Deep South. The fancy trade was a lucrative segment of the domestic slave trade. Slave traders purchased light-skinned female slaves from slave owners in the Chesapeake Bay region at a low price, and then auctioned them to buyers in cities like New Orleans, Louisiana, and Natchez, Mississippi for an enormous profit. The word fancy in the term fancy girl refers to the fact that these female slaves were kept around only as long as they met their owner's fancy. At auction, fancy girls typically sold for 4 to 5 times the price of a female field laborer. Fancy girls often sold for as much or more than a prime male field laborer. Franklin and Armfield. Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trading firm in the U.S. in the 1830s, was located in Alexandria, Virginia, and was very active in the fancy trade. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield were the undisputed tycoons of the domestic slave trade, and the domestic slave trade made them extremely wealthy men. Their specialty was buying large numbers of slaves in the Chesapeake Bay region at a low price, transporting those slaves by foot or by boat to the Deep South, specifically Natchez and New Orleans, and then selling those slaves at slave auctions for an enormous profit. Due to a surplus of slaves in the Chesapeake Bay region, slave traders could not fetch high prices for slaves in Virginia or Maryland. Therefore, Armfield bought slaves and kept them at the firm's jail-like facility in Alexandria until enough slaves were purchased to make transporting them to the Deep South worthwhile. Once the firm purchased enough slaves, a large group of slaves would proceed to New Orleans or Natchez by foot or by boat. In the Deep South, Franklin could sell these slaves for a profit. During the 1830s, Franklin and Armfield sold 1,000 to 1,500 slaves in the Deep South per year. In the Deep South, slaves from Virginia and Maryland were highly prized because they were seen as more compliant than the overworked slaves from the Deep South. Furthermore, the prohibition on the importation of slaves and the growing global demand for cotton created a shortage of slaves in the Deep South. Cultivating cotton was labor-intensive and required slaves. The two started their firm, Franklin and Armfield, in 1828. The firm was located at 1315 Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia. In May 1828, John Armfield signed a multi-year lease, then placed an ad in the Alexandria Phoenix Gazette, He had taken up residence in the house. He could be found there at all times, and he wanted to buy slaves. Looking to purchase 150 likely young Negroes of both sexes between the ages of 8 and 25 years. Armfield promised to pay higher prices in cash than any other purchasers that are in the market, or that may hereafter come into market. He signed the ad with the name of the company he and Isaac Franklin had created a few months earlier, Franklin and Armfield. The building that housed the firm remains at that location today and is an historic site. Franklin and Armfield's headquarters in Alexandria was massive. It took up half a square block on Duke Street. The walled compound included a 3-story, federal-style townhouse that served as the business office, separate housing and pens for male and female captives, kitchens, stables, a hospital, and a tailor shop in which enslaved women made clothing for captives to wear on their arrival in the Deep South. It was a facility dedicated to carrying out the domestic slave trade on an industrial scale. The Franklin and Armfield compound was similar to a penitentiary, with the same apparatus of high walls and bolts and bars to secure the prisoners. Men, women, and children were packed into the building's courtyard and exposed to the elements. In these courtyards, slaves were subject to brutal beatings, rapes, and countless other forms of cruelty. Franklin and Armfield raped female slaves, especially fancy girls, and bragged about it in letters to each other. Both men fathered children with female slaves who were in their captivity. In 1830, the Virginia census indicated that the slaves at the Alexandria facility were mostly children and teenagers. On a daily basis, Armfield advertised in Alexandria and District of Columbia newspapers that he wanted up to 150 enslaved people between the ages of 8 and 25. In addition, Armfield would send agents across Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware in search of slave owners who were willing to part with their slaves for relatively cheap prices. In the 1830s, as crops such as tobacco became less profitable, plantation owners in the Chesapeake Bay region found that selling off surplus slaves produced a reliable source of income. In the meantime, land for cotton cultivation was expanding in the Deep South because of the Indian removal policies of the federal government. Federal deportation of the Choctaw and Chickasaw peoples yielded 18 million acres of land in Mississippi for growing cotton. White people poured into Mississippi to seek their fortune, and they bought land and slaves. As a result of growing demand, 100,000 slaves were transported to Mississippi to grow cotton. Fancy trade. Concerning its highly lucrative fancy trade, the firm's goal was to supply fancy girls from the Chesapeake Bay region to buyers in the Deep South for sexual exploitation. The firm purchased young, attractive, light-skinned female slaves for cash who they believed could bring them a big profit at auction in the Deep South. The firm purchased young female slaves in places like Alexandria, Baltimore, and Richmond. The firm would eventually sell these young female slaves on credit in places like Natchez and New Orleans for a huge profit. Unfortunately, once a young female slave was in the firm's custody, she was routinely raped by members of the firm's staff. The sexual and physical violence might continue for months until the female slave was auctioned to a buyer in the Deep South. Eventually, the female slave would be transported to places like New Orleans or Natchez to be sold at slave auctions as a fancy girl. Fancy girls were auctioned for the purpose of sexual exploitation and would be used by her buyer as a prostitute or concubine. Franklin and Armfield referred to themselves as one-eyed men, a euphemism for their penises. They frequently spoke about raping light-skinned female slaves. Franklin and Armfield brought light-skinned female slaves for their customers in the Deep South, but also for their own sexual gratification.